The crowd had gathered in hushed reverence, their eyes fixed on the immaculate figure standing motionless before the tomb of the unknown soldier. His crisp uniform, gleaming medals, and the silent rhythm of his steps were more than ceremony. They were a living reminder of sacrifice. Each click of his boot against a stone whispered the names of the fallen, names carved not in marble, but in memory. But that sacred silence was about to be broken. From the far side of the crowd, a man stepped forward, not just any man, but a judge known across the city for his arrogance and disdain for tradition. His black robe fluttered in the wind like a dark banner, his chin lifted high as if the solemnity of the place bowed to him alone. Whispers rippled through the gathering. No one dared move closer, but every eye locked on him as he marched straight toward the guard. The tomb guard did not flinch. For years, his training had prepared him for storms, gears, even threats. Nothing was supposed to pierce his discipline. Yet here, in this moment, the storm was not of nature, but of disrespect. The judge's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Remove that medal," he barked, his tone dripping with contempt. "You don't deserve it. Not here, not in front of me." A gasp shivered through the crowd. Mothers pulled their children closer. Veterans clenched their jaws, their knuckles white with restrained fury. Reporters adjusted their cameras, sensing the moment could ignite into something the world would not forget. The guard stood perfectly still, his eyes forward, his breath steady. His silence screamed louder than any words. The judge sneered, circling, like a predator, his insults growing sharper. Each one aimed not just at the soldier before him, but at every sacrifice buried beneath that sacred ground. "This is all theater," he spat. "A show for fools who worship shadows of the past." Every second stretched into eternity. The crowd's heartbeat seemed to sync with the guard's unwavering stillness. Would he move? Would he break? Or would the very weight of tradition crush the arrogance standing before him? Then came the line that would seal this moment in history. The judge leaned closer, his finger almost touching the medal pinned to the guard's chest, and hissed, "Take it off, or I will." The world seemed to stop breathing, and in that silence, in that razor-thin space between disrespect and defiance, the stage was set. The crowd thought the guard would step aside, but in the next moment, the world would learn what honor truly means. The silence of the tomb was not just a rule. It was a covenant, a promise that those who had fallen in battle would never be forgotten, never mocked, never abandoned. For the guard who stood there, every second of stillness was an oath renewed. But to understand the weight of that silence, one had to understand the man behind it. His name was not shouted, nor written on banners. To the public, he was simply the guard, but beneath the uniform, beneath the medals, lived a man who carried scars invisible to the crowd. Years earlier, on a burning desert battlefield, he had lost his closest brother in arms, a firefight that lasted only minutes left behind a lifetime of guilt. His friend's last words were not dramatic, not poetic, only a whispered, "Keep going." Those words clung to him like a chain and a lifeline both. When he returned home, he found himself unable to walk the streets without hearing echoes of gunfire. The medals given to him for valor felt like lead on his chest, heavy with memories of what could not be undone. Friends urged him to take time, to heal, to move on. But he needed more than time. He needed purpose. That purpose came when he applied for one of the most demanding and unforgiving duties in the military, to guard the tomb of the unknown soldier. It was not glory he sought. It was silence. It was discipline. It was redemption. Here, in precise steps and unbroken stillness, he found peace. Every shift, every hour was not about him. It was about the nameless soldiers who never returned home, men and women who would never see their families again. He carried them in his stillness. He honored them with his silence. But silence has enemies. The judge, whose voice had just echoed across the sacred ground, had lived a life in the opposite direction. Where the guard sought discipline, the judge chased power. Where the guard bowed to tradition, the judge broke it for applause. He had climbed his way into office not through respect, but through arrogance, wielding the law like a weapon. His reputation was infamous. Rulings that mocked veterans seeking benefits, speeches that sneered at military rituals, public appearances where he boasted of his freedom from outdated customs. In the polished halls of power, he was untouchable. But here, at the tomb, he was an intruder. For the judge, this place was not sacred. It was theater, and like all theater, he believed he could rewrite the script. He relished controversy, lived for cameras, and had arrived that day with one purpose: to make himself the center of attention. The setting could not have been more symbolic. Arlington National Cemetery stretched endlessly, rows upon rows of white headstones gleaming under the sun, each one a story of sacrifice untold. The air itself carried reverence, as if the ground breathed with the weight of memory. Tourists and veterans alike gathered daily, not for entertainment, but for reflection. This was not a stage, but a sanctuary. The guard understood this. The crowd respected this, but the judge sought to break it. As he stood there, sneering at the man sworn to silence, memories stirred in the guard's mind. He remembered his fallen friend, the weight of that final whisper, "Keep going." He remembered the endless training, the vows he swore before stepping into the sacred post. And he remembered something else, his mother's quiet words the day he joined the army. She said, pressing a hand against his uniform, "It's not given, it's lived." The judge had never lived it. The tension of that day had been building long before his voice struck the air. In the city, debates raged about whether traditions like the tomb guard were necessary or wasteful. Critics claimed it was outdated, mere ceremony in a modern world. Supporters argued it was the very heart of remembrance, a living act of respect for the fallen. The judge had positioned himself firmly in the camp of critics, using every opportunity to undermine and mock. But mocking from behind a podium was one thing. Mocking face to face in the very heart of sacred ground was another. And so, as he stepped into the silence of the tomb, his robe brushing against the marble, the guard knew this was no ordinary provocation. This was a test of discipline against arrogance, of silence against noise, of honor against ego. The crowd felt it too. Veterans shifted uneasily, their eyes dark with anger. Parents whispered hurried explanations to their children, telling them why the guard did not move, why he did not react. Cameras clicked, lenses trained not only on the judge's defiance but on the guard's unbroken stillness. In that moment, two worlds stood in collision. On one side, the judge, a man who believed authority was his alone, who treated respect as a weakness, who thought tradition was clay to be molded by his hand. On the other, the guard, a man who had bled for his brothers, who stood not for himself but for every soldier who could no longer stand, who believed that silence was not emptiness but power. And between them, the tomb itself, the eternal reminder that honor is not owned by the living, but carried for the dead. The judge thought he had come to break a man. What he did not realize was that he had stepped into a battlefield far greater than any court or chamber he had ever ruled. The silence was the guard's weapon, and soon the world would see just how sharp it could be. The air grew heavier with every passing second. The tomb stood silent, eternal, but the man before it, the guard, was now the target of a storm no soldier could ever truly train for. The judge lingered close, his voice rising above the respectful hush of the cemetery. "What are you waiting for?" he jeered. "Take it off. You wear that medal like it means something. But it doesn't. Not anymore." The words hung in the air like poison. Mothers in the crowd instinctively shielded their children, as though the venom might strike them too. Veterans stiffened, jaws locked, hands tightening around canes or folded flags. A group of schoolchildren, their teacher whispering hurried explanations, stood wide-eyed, watching a scene they had never imagined they'd witness. A man spitting on honor in the very place built to protect it. The guard did not move. His breath was steady, chest rising, and falling with mechanical rhythm. His training screamed inside him, "Do not break, do not answer. The tomb comes first. Always." The judge, sensing that silence was both resistance and humiliation, pressed harder. He began to pace, his voice sharpening like a knife against stone. "Do you even know who you're guarding?" he mocked, gesturing wildly at the marble. "No names, no faces, just shadows, ghosts, and you stand here day after day pretending that matters. Tell me, soldier, does it matter?" Gasps echoed. A veteran in the crowd muttered something under his breath, his voice trembling with rage. A woman dabbed, tears from her eyes, shaking her head at the cruelty of it. Reporters adjusted their cameras, hungry to capture the unthinkable. A high official desecrating sacred ground, and a guard who refused to break. But the judge wasn't finished. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice so only the guard could hear, though the crowd strained to catch the venom. "You think silence makes you strong. You think standing still makes you honorable. But let me tell you what you are. You're a coward hiding behind tradition, too weak to speak, too afraid to fight." The guard's eyes did not shift. His face remained stone, but deep inside, memories stirred the firefight, the scream of his brother in arms, the promise he carried. His silence was not weakness. It was his shield, his weapon, his vow. The judge's voice rose again, this time deliberately playing to the audience. "Look at him," he shouted, spinning toward the crowd. A puppet, a mannequin dressed up to impress the ignorant. And you, his finger jabbed at the gathering of veterans, tourists, and families, you worship him like he's some saint. Pathetic. The crowd stirred, anger bubbling dangerously close to eruption. A veteran, his uniform blazer heavy, with medals, took a step forward, but another laid a hand on his shoulder, pulling him back. Not here, he whispered. This isn't our battle. But it was. Everyone knew it. Every second of the guard's stillness magnified the judge's humiliation, and humiliation breeds fury. The judge stepped closer again, invading the sacred 3 feet of space that no one dared cross. His robe brushed against the guard's pristine uniform. He tilted his head, mocking. Do you know who I am? I could strip you of that medal with a single order. I could end this farce right now. Still, nothing. The silence grew unbearable. The crowd's hearts beat in unison with the guard's stillness, each second feeling like a hammer strike. And then came the breaking point. The judge reached out, his hand hovering just inches from the guard's chest, finger twitching as if ready to snatch the medal away. Gasps broke like a wave through the crowd. Children whimpered. Mothers pulled them closer. Veterans leaned forward, every nerve tight. Don't, someone whispered. But the judge wasn't listening. His arrogance had swelled beyond reason. He shoved the guard lightly, just enough to make contact, enough to commit the unforgivable. The sound of the touch, cloth against cloth, was deafening in the silence. The guard did not fall. He did not move. His boots dug deeper into the stone as though rooted there by the weight of every soldier who had ever fallen. The judge sneered, mistaking stillness for surrender. See nothing. You're not a hero. You're a statue. A hollow man. The crowd erupted in murmurs, torn between outrage and awe. A young boy tugged at his father's sleeve and whispered, "Why doesn't he do something?" The father bent, low eyes glistening, and replied, "Because this is what heroes do. They don't break, not even when the world tries to shatter them." The judge turned, basking in the sound of his own cruelty. "You all came here for a show, didn't you? Well, here it is. Your so-called hero, silent while I strip him of dignity." But what the judge could not see was that silence was not defeat. It was defiance. Every insult, every shove, every poisonous word only made the guard's stillness louder. Veterans in the crowd began to murmur prayers under their breath, not for the guard, but for the judge, because they knew what was coming. Not violence, not chaos, but the crushing weight of discipline. The tension reached a breaking point. Reporters leaned forward, cameras flashing, the air electric with expectation. The guard's silence was now a wall, unmovable, impenetrable, and the judge, blind in his arrogance, was about to learn the price of trying to break it. The judge's shove lingered like an echo, its insult magnified by the silence that followed. The crowd had stopped breathing. Even the wind seemed to halt, as though the very air recognized that a boundary had just been crossed. The guard did not flinch. His boots remained planted, his eyes locked forward, his body a fortress of stillness. But something imperceptible shifted. A tightening of the jaw, a subtle rise of the chest. For those trained to see, it was the quiet spark before a storm. The judge mistook it for weakness. He smirked, emboldened by what he saw as victory. "That's it. That's all you've got. You'll let me touch you, shove you, spit on everything you stand for, and still you do nothing. Pathetic." A ripple of anger tore through the crowd. A veteran in his 70s shouted, "Enough." His voice cracked but carried the strength of decades. Children whimpered, clinging to their parents. Reporters clicked frantically, each photo a frozen record of the desecration of sacred ground. The judge, drunk on his own arrogance, made the fatal mistake. He reached out again, this time not with a shove, but with a hand clawing toward the metal pin to the guard's chest. His fingers hovered just inches away, trembling with anticipation of tearing it free. And then it happened. In one fluid, lightning-fast motion, the guard moved. His weapon snapped upward with a precision born not of anger but of training. The gleaming bayonet halted mere centimeters from the judge's chest, not touching, not cutting, but impossibly close. The sharp steel glinted in the sunlight, a line drawn in the air between arrogance and tradition. The crowd gasped as one. Cameras flashed in an explosion of light. Children cried out. Veterans straightened their backs, their eyes wide with pride and disbelief. The judge froze, his smugness evaporating into raw primal fear. His eyes darted down at the blade, then back up to the guard's unblinking stare. For the first time that day he realized this was no mannequin, this was no puppet. This was a soldier, alive with discipline, anchored by centuries of honor, standing as immovable as the tomb itself. The guard did not speak. He did not break formation. He held the weapon steady, perfectly controlled, the message unmistakable. Here is the line. You crossed it once. You will not cross it again. The silence was thunderous, and then came the sound, crisp, commanding, and so rare that it jolted everyone to their core. The guard's voice, low but ringing with authority, cut through the air like a drumbeat. Step back to words, nothing more. But they fell with the weight of an entire army behind them. The judge stumbled backward, his robe tangling around his legs. The sneer on his face was gone, replaced by wide-eyed panic. He opened his mouth as if to protest, to reclaim some shred of authority, but no sound came out. His power, so absolute in the courtroom, meant nothing here. In this place, tradition was the law, and silence was the judge. The crowd erupted in gasps and whispers. A woman clasped her hands together, tears streaming down her cheeks. A child whispered. He spoke. A veteran saluted silently, his hand trembling as he held it high. But the guard was not finished. With precise ceremonial grace, he shifted his weapon back into position, the bayonet gleaming once more in its proper stance. His boots struck the marble with thunderous authority as he resumed his post. Every motion was deliberate, every gesture a reminder. Discipline does not falter. Not here, not ever. The judge, still reeling, attempted one last desperate ploy. You threatened me, he stammered, his voice cracking. You'll answer for this. Do you hear me? But the words fell flat. The crowd was no longer listening to him. They were watching the guard, the living embodiment of stillness, of sacrifice, of unbroken duty. Cameras captured every angle, every second. Reporters scribbled furiously. Realizing the story unfolding before them was no longer about a judge's arrogance, but about a soldier's honor. The judge stepped backward again, as though retreating from a force far greater than he had ever faced in court. His eyes darted to the crowd, searching for support, but all he saw were faces of contempt, of disgust, of shame. His power had dissolved into dust. The guard, having returned to position, did not spare him another glance. His duty was not to humiliate, not to fight, but to stand. And by standing he had one dot. The silence deepened once more, not empty but full of meaning, full of respect. Even the children seemed to understand. This was not just a man at his post. This was a wall against arrogance, a reminder that some lines must never be crossed. The judge trembled, sweat streaking his brow. He adjusted his robe, trying to recover dignity, but it was too late. His face had betrayed him. His fear was etched forever into the memory of the crowd, and soon the memory of the world. The guards, 2 words still echoed in the air. Step back. It was not a threat. It was a command, a reminder that honor is not given by title or position, but lived through action. The judge had tried to break silence with arrogance. The guard had answered with discipline, and in that exchange, the outcome was clear. Arrogance crumbled. Discipline endured. The crowd erupted into hushed applause, not loud, not disrespectful, but a soft, reverent rhythm of hands meeting hands. Veterans saluted. Parents explained quietly to their children what they had just witnessed. Reporters knew they were documenting history. The judge slunk backward into the crowd, his shoulders hunched, his face pale. He muttered something under his breath, but no one listened. His power had evaporated in the face of a soldier, who had not even moved until pushed to the brink. The guard resumed his silent vigil, eyes forward, body unshaken, weapon gleaming. To him nothing had changed. His duty remained, his vow remained, his silence remained, but to everyone else everything had changed. The cemetery was silent again, but it was no longer the calm reverence of before. This silence burned, electric with awe. The guard had returned to stillness, his weapon perfectly aligned, his posture unbroken. To the casual eye, it was as though nothing had happened, but to those who had seen, nothing would ever be the same. The judge staggered back, clutching at the folds of his robe, his face pale, his arrogance shattered. The bayonet's gleam still haunted his eyes, and the 2 words, "Step back," echoed louder than any courtroom gavel he had ever struck. The crowd, however, had changed too. No longer a passive audience, they now stood united, veterans and children, mothers and tourists, every eye fixed, not on the judge, but on the guard. For the first time in his life, the judge had been stripped of his stage. A veteran in the front row lifted his trembling hand in salute, his eyes wet with pride. Another followed, then another. Within moments, dozens stood with hands raised. Silent salutes offered not to the judge, not even to the confrontation, but to the unwavering stillness of the guard who had held his ground without breaking. The judge tried to rally, his voice cracking as he shouted, This is an outrage. He threatened me. I demand he be removed from his post immediately." but his words fell into the void. No one listened. Reporters rushed forward, cameras snapping. Like gunfire, microphones thrust toward the guard, but he gave them nothing. Not a word, not a glance. His silence was the answer. His stillness was the statement. Security officers, alerted by the commotion, pushed their way through the crowd. They approached the judge, not the guard, their expressions caught between duty and disbelief. One officer asked firmly, "Sir, we need you to step away from this area." "Me," the judge barked, his voice shrill. "I am the victim here. Arrest that soldier. He pulled a weapon on me." But even the officers weren't convinced. The murmurs of the crowd rose against him, a tide of disgust and outrage. "You shoved him," someone shouted. "You disrespected the tomb," cried another. A woman's voice rang clear. "You're the one who should be ashamed." The judge's face twisted with frustration. He tried to raise his voice above the storm, but the more he spoke, the less anyone cared. His words collapsed beneath the weight of the moment. The guard remained silent, immovable, the very image of discipline. The contrast was too sharp, too undeniable. On one side, arrogance unraveling into chaos. On the other, honor embodied in stillness. One of the reporters lowered his camera and whispered to his colleague, "This is history. This will be everywhere by nightfall." And he was right. Phones had already captured the shove, the bayonet's flash, the commanding voice. Within hours, millions would see it. Within days, the world would know. A judge had tried to strip honor from a soldier, and in doing so, stripped himself bare. The judge's last attempt at control sputtered out. He pointed a trembling finger at the guard, his voice cracking. "This isn't over. Do you hear me? This isn't." But his words were drowned out by the sudden, unified sound of applause. Not wild, not disrespectful, but solemn, reverent, steady. The kind of applause given not for a performance, but for a vow kept. Veterans saluted through it. Children clapped shyly. Families stood taller. The guard did not move, did not react. He was the eye of the storm, unshaken, eternal. The judge looked around, realizing the truth. He had lost, not in law, not in politics, but in honor. And in this place, honor was the only court that mattered. Security guided him away. His protests weak and hollow, swallowed by the murmurs of disgust, and the rhythm of hands meeting hands. He vanished into the crowd, a man stripped not of medals, but of dignity. The guard resumed his vigil. Step by step his boots struck the marble once more. Click, pause, turn, silence. The ritual continued, unbroken, as though arrogance had never dared trespass here. And that was the true victory, not the humiliation of the judge, not the applause of the crowd, but the unshaken discipline of a soldier who remembered why he stood there. Because the tomb was not about the living, it was about the dead. It was about sacrifice. It was about a promise that no insult, no arrogance, no man could ever break. The cameras captured the contrast one last time, chaos in the background, stillness in the foreground, and in that image the world saw the truth. Discipline had triumphed over disorder. Honor had silenced arrogance, and the guard, silent, motionless, eternal, had won. Asterisk, the echoes of the judge's protests faded into the distance as security guided him away. The crowd slowly settled, though their faces still glowed with awe. The guard, however, had already returned to his post, his boots striking the marble with that same measured rhythm. Click, pause, turn, silence. To him, nothing had changed. Duty was not shaken by chaos. His oath was not broken by arrogance. His vigil continued. And yet, for those who watched, everything had changed. The colonel in charge of the detail arrived moments later, his expression stern, his steps brisk. He had seen many things in his career, but nothing like this. He stopped, a few feet away, observing the guard's perfect posture, the unbroken precision of his march. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a gesture that stunned those who noticed, the colonel raised his hand in a crisp salute. It was not protocol. It was personal. The guard did not acknowledge it. His eyes remained forward, his rhythm unchanged. But the colonel's salute spoke volumes. Respect, pride, an acknowledgement that discipline had prevailed where anger could have ruled. Nearby, a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. His small voice carried just enough to be heard by those around him. "Mom, he's a hero, isn't he?" The mother knelt, her eyes glistening. She nodded slowly. "Yes, not because he fought back, but because he didn't have to." The boy stared at the guard with wide eyes, as though seeing a statue come to life. His whisper, though soft, seemed to ripple through the onlookers like a thread stitching their emotions together. "Hero." The crowd lingered long after the judge was gone. Veterans stood in silence, saluting. Families held their children tighter, whispering explanations of what they had just witnessed. Reporters, for once, lowered their cameras, realizing some moments deserved reverence more than headlines. But within the guard, a quieter story played out. Beneath the uniform, beneath the discipline, his heart carried a weight invisible to all. The medal the judge had tried to strip away was not just metal and ribbon, it was a reminder of his fallen brother, and every time his eyes caught the faint gleam of it, he remembered the desert, the chaos, the final whispered words, "Keep going tonight." When his shift ended, he knew what he would do. He would return to his locker, unpin the medal, and hold it against a dog tag he kept tucked safely in his pocket. His friend's name etched into metal, his friend's memory etched into his soul. The world might see the medal as honor. He saw it as a debt. The judge had tried to make it about pride, but for him it was always about remembrance. That as he marched, step by step, that truth anchored him. His silence was not emptiness, it was a conversation with the past. His stillness was not weakness, it was strength given to him by those who could no longer stand. The colonel lowered his salute at last and whispered to himself, "Carry on, soldier." His voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of command and respect intertwined, and the guard did carry on. His boots clicked, his rifle gleamed, his silence thundered. The crowd began to drift away, but none left unchanged. Each carried the memory of what they had seen, a man tested beyond reason who answered not with rage, not with violence, but with unshaken honor. And somewhere among them, a boy's whisper lingered like a promise, "Hero." The crowd eventually dispersed, the sun dipping lower over the marble stones of Arlington. Yet the silence that lingered was not emptiness, it was reverence. What they had witnessed was more than a confrontation, it was a reminder. Tradition had been tested, and it had held. The guard had not spoken a word, yet his silence shouted across generations. It told the arrogant, the reckless, the loud voices of the present that some things cannot be mocked, bought, or stripped away. Honor is not awarded by men in robes or politicians in offices. Honor is carried in the marrow of those who choose discipline over chaos, duty over comfort, stillness over pride. That is why the tomb guard stands, not for applause, not for medals, but for something deeper, a vow to the fallen that they will never be forgotten. The judge believed power came from titles and authority, but in that moment, stripped bare by a single soldier's resolve, the world saw the truth. Power without respect is weakness. Discipline without compromise is strength, and so, the guard resumed his post as if nothing had happened. Step, pause, turn, step. His boots echoed like a heartbeat across the stone, a heartbeat for every name never spoken, every sacrifice never recorded. A child's whisper called him a hero, and perhaps he is, but the guard himself would never claim the word. In his mind, the real heroes were the ones lying beneath the marble, in silence eternal. He was merely their voice, and sometimes that voice is strongest when it says nothing at all. So, as you leave this story behind, remember the lesson carried in his stillness. Tradition is not weakness. Stillness is strength. Silence, when chosen in honor, speaks louder than 1,000 shouts. If this story moved you, share it, speak of it, pass it on, because the world needs reminders that courage is not always in the clash of swords or the roar of anger. Sometimes, it is in a single man who refuses to step aside.